slide. Next. Okay. As Michael has already stressed this point in the introduction, I will also make some kind of stressing as well that indeed the importance of the trusted list and the correctness and availability, but also the appropriate security, the appropriate management, and the follow-up or the due date file events follow-up in order to make these trusted list as a reliable and not only a constitutive but also reliable source of information whether a trust service provider and the trust service it provides are qualified, from when and until when. These extremely important files have to be correctly implemented, and any error or any mistake in this context will lead wrong decision made by relying parties. In terms of availability, just a reminder that all these files, all these trusted lists have to be 24/7 available with a 3/9 availability, meaning that it's only a 8.75 hours downtime a year. So it is important that you may be able to monitor the availability of the trusted list. The TL Manager facilities will also provide some tools for you to monitor this availability. And it includes monitoring not only the availability, but also the expiry of the trusted list, the expiry of the TLSO, the Trusted List Scheme Operator certificates, and the availability of the right certificate in the list of the list. So the notification process is also an important aspect to manage and to monitor with regard to the correct and appropriate verification of the signature of the trusted list. So it implies quite a lot, not so many, but still important aspects of organizational measures and procedures that you will have to implement in your organization in order for the trusted list scheme operator to react on due time on the availability issues and on the reporting of issues. We also have experienced some regular and recurrent problems in terms of synchronization issues when countries are publishing the same trusted list in different places from different servers, and sometimes the synchronization of these publications are not perfect. So it may lead to the relying parties to download an old version of the trusted list rather than the current one. In terms of the securization or the security of the publication, of course, you are all aware that the trusted list XML version has to be signed or sealed, and that the certificates that are allowing the verification of those signatures has to be notified to the European Commission so that they can be included in the list of the list. But also the regulation requires that the publication is to be secured. So in addition to the signing or sealing of the XML trusted list, those trusted lists should be published under HTTPS. Still, we can register a slight progression of the conversion from the HTTP to the HTTPS publication, but still there are a few of member states which are still in HTTP publication of the trusted list. And when you select an HTTP or a TLSL, an HTTPS or a TLS certificates, please be sure that you select a certificate which is recognized by most of the off-the-shelf application, and in particular, which is recognized by Java, so that the relying parties may not have troubles in or strange messages when consuming your trusted list or the publication of the trusted list, and maybe why not using Quacks for this. Also regarding the security of the signature of the trusted list, there is very easy prevention to implement in order to prevent the XML signature wrapping attacks, which is actually, as you may know, the signature are signed in an XML version, but the signature is computed on either parts of the file or the entire file, XML file. And when the signature is computed on very specific part, or the reference which is used in the signature of the XML file is pointing to a very specific reference or part of the document, it may lead to some attacks that are replacing or substituting information or adding information to the XML files that may not be noticed by the relying party when consuming the trusted list. So this potential vulnerability is on the trusted list processing side, not in the trusted list itself, but the easy way to circumvent and to prevent these kind of attacks is to use the reference, the double quote reference in the signature. That means that the entire document is actually signed. So this is the usage that should be favored, and it is implemented by default in TL Manager. Still some very easy to fix and sometimes recurrent issue is that there is also a rule that says that the TLSO certificate organization attribute in the subject D and those subject distinguished name has to match in case-sensitive way the name of the trusted list scheme operator organization in the trusted list. So sometimes it's a difference as stupid as a comma or a character which is not in upper or minor case. So there are few moments where you can check that, of course, when renewing the certificate and rekeying the certificate to make sure that the request for the new certificate is including the right name case sensitive as it is published in the trusted list. But also when you made a mistake or when the content is different by a single comma, for example, or a single case character or upper instead of minor, the easiest way may be while waiting for the renewal of the certificate to change the name in the TLSO and to add in the trusted list the name of the TLSO and to correct and to put a value which is exactly matching the information in the certificate. Two more administrative and sometimes boring issues, but still we switched quite a long time ago to the old directive legislative model to the new regulation model, but still some of the pages which are explaining the context, and in particular the national context and sometimes the added information that has to be known from the users in the context of consuming trusted lists, in the context of consuming qualified trust services, has to be updated from the ancient legislation context to the new one. And this includes the scheme information URI, which is actually a URI to a page that explains and provides a very specific set of information that are required by the Commission implementing decision and are structured by this decision. And there is even a FAQ item that explains and provides some guidance in how to provide this information on this web page. So sometimes I'm pretty sure that for some of the member states, it still needs to be implemented or to be improved. The same is for the scheme rules national part of the field and of the provision, which has been improved because in the past it were even worse than that, but still roughly half of the member states still needs either to provide information to populate these pages and or to update the information. And sometimes it is as stupid as changing the link or the URI which is used to provide some information within the page or to redirect, because it may happen that the structure of the website that has been used previously by the member state has changed with this new links, and then the information which is provided in those pages are no longer available or are still outdated and referring to the ancient directive implementation in the member states. Even more important with regard to the correct provision of the information about the qualified status of a QTSP, but also in particular of a qualified trust service, is the information about the identity or the digital identity of, and you may know that the granularity of the information that is provided to the grant of a qualified status to a qualified trust service is as a whole, but in the trusted list you may have many or multiple entries that are reflecting the technical implementation of this trust service or this qualified trust service as it is implemented by the qualified trust service provider. So there may be different entries which are reflecting the different technical issuing CAs or the technical identities of the qualified trust service. And all of these and each of these entries may receive an indication that whether or not they are part of the grant of the qualified status. So each and every of those entries will be allocated either a granted or a withdrawn information regarding to the qualified status. The same applies for the non-qualified, which is recognized at national level and deprecated at national level, but let's focus on the qualified one. So each and every of these technical entries, they have to refer to only one single digital identity, so one single public key that may be conveyed by one or more certificates. That's not an issue, but all these certificates which are conveying the public key, they must relate to the exact same public key within the same entry. So when you have a new certificate because, for example, the trust service provider has extended the validity period of the usage of the public key and the certificate, or they're changing from SHA-1 signing of the certificates to SHA-2 signing or SHA-3 signing, then they have a new certificate corresponding to the same public key. What you only have to do in the trusted list is to add this digital identity to the current entry, not create new historical information. And all those certificates has to refer to the same public key within the single entry, and you cannot have multiple entries with the exact same public key unless they are associated to different types of qualified trust services. And a type of a qualified trust service is the combination of the service type identifier and the additional information in the service information extension referring to the type. So whether it is for electronic signature, for example, or for electronic seal, or for website authentication. Having said that, it happens that you may have to reflect some changes in the decision or in the status of an entire service, or for some very specific technical part or technical related entries of a service. When doing this, the importance is also to maintain the date's consistency. So which kind of data is to be included in the current status starting date and time, for example, when I'm changing this kind of information with regard to a service, and what is important to make sure of the consistency between that date and the list issue date, and time, and the signing time of the trusted list. The most important thing to remind is that backdating service status information is not allowed. Just because, well, mainly because it is a constitutive information, the trusted list, so you cannot change information in the past, because then it creates uncertainty in the legal information and the legal certainty of the information. So backdating is not possible. No antedating of the grant and no changing in the past of the grant, but also no extension of the grant by pushing forward the withdrawal date for trusted list information. So the main rule is that the current status starting date and time has to be after the effective date of the publication, after the list issue date and time, and after the time of the signing of the trusted list. So in practice, it may be in the same window, 1 day window period, and nothing prevents to announce changing in the future. Because then you don't touch the legal certainty. On the contrary, you do not change the past, but you may announce that within a week, actually, it will be officially granted. But going in the past is not permitted, or changing the past is not permitted, to be more precise. Also, one very specific, and I may agree that it may not be so intuitive when using Trusted List Manager for that. The simple action of changing the current status or updating the current status of a list service entry requires to first push down the current information to an historical entry. So you first have to create a new entry, and TL Manager will take automatically the current information and push down to the history. So it will take the date, it will by default take the date and time of today, and then you can change the current status information to a withdrawal, for example. Because if you do the exact opposite, and you may think that, okay, it's more intuitive that I have to change the current status. I go to the current status information, I change the information to the granted to withdrawn, for example, and then I forgot to create the historical instance. Then it leads to a drama, because then you have changed a complete full history of the information, and you put the withdrawn for maybe back to the 1st of July 2016, which can be a big nightmare for the output of the trust of the related qualified trust services. So when changing the current information on the status, and in particular the status of a current entry of the service, you have to first push down the current information to the history by just creating an historical instance. So you edit the entry, create a new history. It will be pre-filled with all the exact information from the current status and provide you with a default date of today. And then you change the information within the current service part. Just a reminder as well on the proper use of the service information extension, additional service information that is to be used when refining the service type. So clearly to indicate whether the grant is associated or the withdrawal is associated to the qualified service, but for electronic signature, for electronic seal, or for website authentication, or a combination, because you can, within the same entry, combine those information and combine them with the timeline, so that you have a way to express without duplicating as many entries as you want to have, or the fine-tuning, to combine in one entry and according to one single timeline, whether you have granted the qualified status for electronic signature, for website authentication, or for electronic seals when it is relevant, to the service entry digital identity. But it requires also to clearly understand this principle, so that along the timeline when you have from period 1 to period 2 to period 3 to period 4 and to the current status, all the information and the type is associated will precise the grant of the technical instance of the service towards a very specific type of service. Let's say, for example, the issuance of qualified certificates, and whether it is for electronic signature, for electronic seals, or website authentication along the timeline. So it's a powerful way of expressing this information, but of course, doing mistakes will also have an impact on the perception and the interpretation of the relying parties versus what you really have decided to grant. Another reminder also with regard to the cases related to the termination of a trust service, and in particular of a qualified trust service from a qualified trust service provider. Maybe one thing to remind is that you have to understand whether you have decided to withdraw, or whether the qualified trust service provider has decided to terminate a service in its entirety, and whether it is this entirety means that by terminating this, it does no longer have any provision of a specific type of qualified trust service, or whether it has terminated only a part of the technical implementation of one very specific type of qualified trust service, which is completely different, of course, because in the first instance, then he is no longer qualified for the provisioning of this specific type of qualified trust service, and in the second case, he still may be qualified for the provision of this qualified trust service, but it happens that one specific line of production, one or more specific line of production, one of more specific technical instances that was used to manage and operate for the provision of the service has been terminated. Whatever the reason, it may be for just business reason, or it may be because it's a renewal of the technical instance and it is going to an end of life and it is renewed by a new one, so it will most probably be accompanied by new entries in the trusted list. So it does not mean that as a whole it will be withdrawn the qualified certificates, the qualified status for this provisioning, but these very specific technical instance will or may need to be changed the status from granted to withdrawn. And of course, it has to be ensured that this termination is according to the plan, to the termination plan, which should cover all these, whether it is partially an implementation of a termination or a complete termination of an implementation. But with regard to the specific situation of the qualified trust service providers issuing qualified certificate of a certain type, these kind of termination may not, or depending on the context of the termination, it may not automatically lead to a withdrawal of a qualified status, because he may simply decide that for business reason, okay, I will stop issuing certificates from today, but still I will maintain my service as a qualified status for maintaining the life cycle management of the existing certificates, but I will just decide stopping issuing new certificates. So this is part of the kind of any changes that the QTSP has to notify the supervisory body according to Article 2024.2.a. It may be perceived by the QTSP as a termination because, okay, I will terminate this service, but it may be only from your side a partial termination. It's just a technical information and technical instance. So each and every termination case has to be first carefully analyzed, and carefully analyzed in the context of what does it mean to be reflected as information to be conveyed in the trusted list. So not always termination means withdrawal of the qualified status. And also in the very specific case where a qualified trust service provider issuing qualified certificate of a certain type decide to stop everything, for example, related to this provisioning of this very specific type of certificate. So he decided to stop everything. But still he has found one QTSP providing the same type of qualified certificates, so being granted the qualified status for the provisioning of the same type, that will maintain the life cycle management of the existing certificates. So of course, in these cases, the former QTSP that were qualified for this type of issuance of qualified certificates will no longer, from a legal point of view, be granted a qualified status because for example, it is no longer existing or is no longer providing anything regarding to this provision. He will not issue any new qualified certificates under its name, and also the taking over party that is a qualified will not issue new qualified certificates under the name of the previous or the former QTSP. So he may issue qualified certificate under his own name using different service entries. But he will probably, or depending on the cases, he will maintain the record keeping, the archival, the provisioning of the certificate validity status information for the existing certificates, and progressively probably migrate this customer bases to its own infrastructure and delivering them with new certificates, and just maintain this information. So this is one of the contexts where, provided the entire service or the remaining part of the service has been taken over by a qualified trust service provider in a way that continues to meet the requirements of the regulation for the qualified level, then the termination or the withdrawal of a qualified status from a legal point of view from a provider will not have any impact on the qualified certificates that are remaining in place, because the service is maintained by a QTSP. But this has to be reflected correctly in the trusted list, because in the trusted list, due to the constitutive value of these trusted lists, when something is written in the trusted list, it has a very specific effect. And the way the interpretation rules are defined in the Commission decision are that whenever you put withdrawal in the current status information regarding to a service, it means withdrawal. So from that date, you are giving this change and putting withdrawal. Each and every certificate that is not yet expired or revoked will no longer be considered as qualified. And any new certificate that would be created by the same technical instance is no longer qualified. So if you want to express the fact that, okay, in this context, the QTSP is legally withdrawn the qualified status because it no longer exists, and he stopped issuing new certificates, but he has delegated and he has transferred, and somebody else, which is a qualified trust service provider, being granted the qualified status for the same type of service, has taken over all the liabilities and responsibilities and operational services regarding to the existing certificates in a way that, okay, it has been assessed and verified with the supervisory body, potentially with the help of a conformity assessment body, that it meets the requirements, then I may maintain the qualified status to this specific entry from the old QTSP to a qualified status, to a granted status, but this has to be reflected by the addition of a service information extension, service information extension taken over by to provide information about the taking over party. So this is what is explained in the different slides over. As also it was explained in previous webinars, and especially in the context, and in particular in the context of the service entries related to the issuance of qualified certificate of a certain type. You have also the a powerful tool, which is the service information extension qualification extension, where you can also, by using this expansion, express very powerful extensions that will either fine-grain the remaining grant of the qualified status and probably excluding some of the production line that would not be maintained or that would still be maintained not according to the qualified level. So the service information qualification extension are very powerful tools, but also, of course, it has to be used carefully, because if you put wrong statements, then it will be that are not matching your decision, then of course it will be interpreted differently by the relying parties. One of the recurrent issues, but that has been also somehow solved in the context of the new TL manager, so moved from an error to an information, to an info status, so the gray question mark instead of the orange attention sign or the red cross, is relating to the expired certificate that are associated or conveying the public key of the service digital information in the service entry. So it's no longer considered as by default as an error. It's just provided as an information for you to check that, okay, is it related to a mistake that I've done, or is it, or no, it's okay. It's an old service, but still it's part of a service that is maintained and with a qualified status, because there is no longer a certificate that is issued, but it is maintained by the same trust service provider in a qualified status for providing certificate validity status information and things like that. There may be some questions or some concerns by leaving the qualified status to something which is fully terminated and for which the certificate has been expired. So maybe there is still a better practice to remove the qualified status, because if everything is expired, if everything is terminated with regard to a very specific technical instance of a service, then why should you maintain the qualified status for this kind of thing? It will change anything if you withdraw it from today, because the way they are providing this information, or the last CRL, for example, or the last service validity status information, which is compiled for all the certificate that has been issued so far, it will be sufficient for maintaining the sustainability of the past signatures. But in order to make the same reporting to all these cases, whatever the reason behind the implementation of or leaving this certificate expired is, we decided to change the error display to an information display. Just also for all of you that are using home updated versions of the TL Manager, that's running the TL Manager version in your installations, be careful to deploy the latest version of TL Manager, because whenever there is a publication of a new version of TL Manager, it is either to provide some new features, to provide improvement, but also sometimes to fix some bugs, some issues that were present in the previous versions. So it is important for you that if you deploy your local instance of TL Manager, that you follow up the publication of the new releases, and then you update these as well. The new version since a few releases have integrated the TLCC, so the conformance checker of the TL Manager. But for those of you that are not using TL Manager, then the TLCC can still be an helpful tool. The SHA-2 companion file is also an important element in order to facilitate the discovery of a new version, or the publication of a new version of the TL Manager. And TL Manager of the trusted list, and TL Manager allows you to create this SHA-2 companion file in an easy way. A not so recurrent issue, because the European Commission is not so often creating a pivot list of the list, but still there was recently a publication of a new pivot LOTL. Publication of a new pivot LOTL has an implication for your management of your trusted list by updating the list of the list scheme operator certificates in the pointer to the list of the list. So normally, and it has been corrected in this new version. So whenever this happens, TL Manager will detect that there is a new pivot list of the list and will inform you by an error message that on your trusted list information and trusted list pointer to the list of the list, you have an action to be performed by using the magic wand to update the list of the list scheme operator certificates. And Olivier Barrette will go further in explaining this afterwards. There is also, not happening so many times, but there is in the life cycle of a trusted list scheme operator and the body, a European member state body in charge of the managing of the trusted list, that this entity will change and will be replaced by a new entity. So there will be a need for a member state to changing TLSO, to changing the TLSO name, to changing the TLSO certificates, and probably also the location of the national trusted list, because the URL structure will change. So how to manage the impact of such a change with regard to your trusted list and towards the notification you have to do towards the European Commission. All of these steps and procedures and tips are explained in the fact entry, that you will find in the TLSO community portal. So it is step by step explaining what are the phases and the actions you will have to perform. Linked to this, but also linked to the natural life cycle of the TLSO certificates, whenever you need to create and renew these TLSO certificates, there are some rules that have to be followed by when selecting the provider, but in particular when selecting the content of the TLSO certificate. So it must either be a self-signed certificate or a certificate that is issued by TSP Trust Service that is listed in the trusted list, your national trusted list, or in another one from a EU member state. There are rules on the country code organization and key usage extensions. The extended key usage should be present, so it's whenever there is a should in this list, it's an option. So it's not a requirement. Whenever there is a shall, it is a requirement. So you have to make sure that the combination of the key usage and the extended key usages leads to an appropriate usage of the certificate or the private key with regard to the signing of the trusted list. But we'll find all these information or requirements also in the clause 571 of the standards. And the TL Manager, as it will also be explained by Olivier Barrette afterwards, will provide you with a new feature to check whether your TLSO certificate is compliant to these rules or not, so in order to facilitate your life life when selecting or renewing the certificate for your scheme operator. So it was quick and dense. So I hope you're not asleep or felt asleep or too either bored or afraid by all these type of things. But I think they are quite known already. But still, we are facing to these errors in the recurring reviews. But also it may also be due to the fact that peoples and organizations are changing, not only in the European Commission that we have heard in the introduction, but also in the member states or the member state bodies which are in charge of the trusted list. So there is a need to make sure that there is an appropriate training and information of those operators when they are in charge of the management of the trusted list. So if you have any questions or remark or suggestions for future point in this recurrent section of the webinar, then feel free to drop them in the chat or to interact with us and with the others, so we can be aware and prepare for next time. Thank you.